The process of production of capital. Part 3. The production of absolute surplus value. If you haven't been following the other videos in this series, I suggest you watch these first before getting into this one. Many of us on the radical left will be familiar with the argument that capitalism is an inherently exploitative system. The idea that capitalism is about the extraction of surplus value from workers seems to come from this third part of this first volume of Capital. Importantly, Marx never actually says that exploitation itself is morally wrong. Exploitation is a bit of a loaded term, but the way that Marx is using it is in a mathematical sense, to explain the technical fact that the worker is putting in more than they're getting out. Let's explore this further. We left the argument off at the buying and selling of labour power. The basic finding was that those buying labour power relate to money in a different way from those of us that are selling labour power. Insofar as those buying labour power are acting as capitalists, they are setting out to accumulate as much money as possible. We are selling labour power so that we can afford to purchase the commodities we need to survive. So different groups of people are relating to money in different ways. Recall from part 1 that a commodity could be a means of consumption, e.g. a Happy Meal, or a means of production, e.g. the machinery needed to produce Happy Meals. When we bring the means of production into the equation, we also find that just as different groups of people in capitalist society relate to money in different ways, these groups also relate to the means of production in different ways. Capitalism is based on the buying and selling of labour power, and that alters how the labour process is carried out in specific ways. As workers, we must operate the means of production, and in a capitalist society, we do this under the control of capitalists who have purchased means of production and labour power. Secondly, the product of that labour process does not belong to the worker, but instead the capitalist. We saw before how every human society has to produce useful objects for its participants in order to survive. But in the capitalist mode of production, the aim of the labour process is not just to produce use values. Yes, the product must itself be useful in the sense that was discussed in part 1, otherwise nobody's going to exchange for it. However, use value is not the thing desired for its own sake. Remember that the reason the capitalists are buying labour power is because it is a special kind of commodity which can create value. There's quite an entertaining passage in chapter 7 in which Marx deals with the capitalist objections to the analysis. Impersonating the capitalist, Marx says, "Can the worker produce commodities out of nothing merely by using his arms and legs? Did I not provide him with the materials through which and in which alone his labour could be embodied? And as the greater part of society consists in such impecunious creatures, have I not rendered society an incalculable service by providing my instruments of production, my cotton and my spindle, and the worker too, for have I not provided him with the means of subsistence? Am I to be allowed nothing in return for all this service?" Marx's rebuttal to that is, has the worker not performed an equivalent service in return by changing his cotton and his spindle into yarn? There is a distinction between the process of creating value and the process of valorisation. Valorisation is simply the continuation of the process of creating value beyond the point where the money laid out on wages is replaced with an equivalent value created in the labour process. I say replaced rather than exchanged because we must remember that the capitalist pays for labour power and not labour itself. If valorisation is taking place, then as workers, we're putting more value into the system than we get back in wages. We have the general formula for capital, which is MCM-, money, commodity, money dash. At this level, what this formula on its own doesn't show is what commodities the capitalist is buying, and the productive process in which the capital is valorised. But of course, the capitalist buys labour power and means of production, which are combined in the labour process to produce a product. So capitalists have a sum of money which they start with, and part of that is advanced on means of production. In the labour process, the means of production are used up, and their value is transferred to the product of the labour process. So if the means of production are totally used up, their value will be completely transferred to the product. Whereas if they aren't totally used up, their value will be partially transferred to the product. Marx calls this portion of capital constant capital, which is formalised with the letter C. This is in contrast to labour power. Labour power creates new value. The value is newly generated. Marx calls the portion of capital used to pay wages variable capital, which is formalised with the letter V. Here's where exploitation comes in. There is a difference between the newly generated value from labour power and the variable capital, and that difference is the surplus value, which we formalise with the letter S. The value of a mass of commodities produced within a certain time frame can therefore be formalised as C plus V plus S. We've got the portion of capital which is laid out on means of production, insofar as that's consumed in the labour process, which is the constant capital C. We've got the portion of capital laid out on wages, the variable capital V, and finally we've got the surplus value S, which is the difference between the value newly generated by the workers operating the means of production and the money we get back in wages. Additionally, this enables us to construct a formula for the rate of surplus value, which is S over V, surplus over variable. Let's say that £500 is the capital advanced. Say that the capitalist has £410 laid out on means of production, constant capital, and £90 laid out on wages, variable capital. When the process of production is finished, let's say that the workers have produced a surplus of £90. This means that the capital has increased from £500 to £590. The new value produced is £180. That would mean that the rate of surplus value in this example is 90 over 90, which is 100%. The worker produces enough to get their wages back, which they can use to buy the commodities they need to survive, but the worker also produces extra for the capitalist. That extra labour above the necessary labour is called surplus labour. While the rate of surplus value is expressed as S over V, surplus over variable, the rate of profit is expressed as S over C plus V, surplus over constant and variable, which is the total capital advanced. So we can calculate the rate of profit here as 90 over 500, which is 18%. So the rate of surplus value in our example is 100%, but the rate of profit is 18%. The distinction between surplus value and profit will become more useful in the later volumes. Marx says, the rate of surplus value is therefore an exact expression for the degree of exploitation of labour power by capital or of the worker by the capitalist. Let me just reiterate that Marx never says that exploitation is morally wrong, rather it is a simple mathematical principle where you're putting in more than you're getting out. Marx distinguishes between absolute surplus value and relative surplus value. Absolute surplus value, which we're looking at in this part, is produced by means of increasing how much work a worker does within an accounting period, so having a longer workday, for example. On the other hand, relative surplus value, which we're going to look at in the next part of this series, is produced by decreasing the amount of socially necessary labour time. For example, decreasing the value of wage goods, wage repression, and increasing the productivity of labour. Following his chapter on the rate of surplus value, he goes into an extensive study of the working day, which is again about the capitalist increasing how much work a worker does within an accounting period, the number of hours a day, for example. Marx says, in the history of capitalist production, the establishment of a norm for the working day presents itself as a struggle over the limits of that day, a struggle between collective capital, i.e. the class of capitalists, and collective labour, i.e. the working class. He notes that capital takes no account of the health and the length of life of the worker unless society forces it to do so. Think about how, very recently, Trump has been saying that the cure can't be worse than the disease. On Trump's view, at this time, we've got to keep working rather than taking the very serious advice of medical professionals to stay home. Elderly, immunocompromised, and generally vulnerable people are to be sacrificed on the altar of capital. If we don't work, that cuts into their profits. On Trump's view, the prospect of losing profits is worse than people dying. We have an explanation for that which goes right back to Marx. Our labour is the source of their profits, and they're willing to keep not just labour, but surplus labour going regardless of the detrimental effects on our public health as a society, which could include the spread of disease and death. Marx goes into detail about the negative physical health effects of overwork on the worker, especially children. He listens to what the doctors of the time were saying about this and directly references them. He makes the incisive point that the establishment of a normal working day is the product of a protracted and more or less concealed civil war between the capitalist class and the working class. And he also mentions the absolutely despicable rhetoric of the capitalists who claim that they're in favour of the so-called freedom of labour, while the workers themselves condemned on their banners the slavery of the Factory Acts. In keeping with our assessment so far that capitalism really doesn't rest on free markets but on the initiation of force, consider Marx's observation that earlier in capitalism's historical development, before they were forced to shorten the working day because of the workers' movements, statutes were in place which forcibly lengthened the working day. In other words, capital had to come to the aid of the state to raise the extent of exploitation of the worker. People say, oh well, that's just corporatism, not the fluffy bunny capitalism that exists in my head. The word corporatism, when it's used in this way, is simply a clever device used to get you to ignore the historical development of the system that we're living under. And it's very important to recognise that Marx's analysis is not a conspiracy theory. The capitalists do not lengthen the working day because they're simply bad or evil people. As individuals, they could seem like perfectly nice people. But insofar as they're acting as capitalists, they're playing an institutional role which requires that they maximise their profits. We therefore have to ask the question, at what cost? At the cost of our health and well-being? I think this is a good point on which to leave you. Tune in next time for part 4, which looks at the production of relative surplus value. Of course, do your bit for our global community, stay home and stay well. Full solidarity to anyone who's unable to self-isolate due to living in abusive relationships, or if self-isolation means going home to an abusive family. I suggest that people donate to the Swarm Collective, sex worker advocacy and resistance movement, as they're trying to gather a hardship fund for sex workers who are among some of the most economically vulnerable at this time where physical distancing is necessary. You can make a donation at swarmcollective.org/donate. All donations made to Swarm from now to the 30th of April will go directly into this fund and will provide mutual aid to sex workers in the UK who are in severe financial hardship. Stay safe and thanks for watching.